All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wilton E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. My name is Daniel Tatchik, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Scott Institute, and we are so happy to have you all here for today's distinguished lecture. Today's event is co-sponsored and co-hosted by the Steinbrenner Institute for Environmental Education and Research. Great organization on campus, so we're really thankful and grateful for their support for today's event. We're very honored to have Dr. Gretchen Goldman join us today, and we'll be giving her a very proper introduction in just a moment. But first, so in case you're unfamiliar with the Scott Institute, we are Carnegie Mellon's hub for all things energy. We're essentially the front door for energy and climate at Carnegie Mellon. We give out seed funding to help grow new energy-related research projects. We support new research initiatives across campus by bringing together over 180 different faculty affiliates working across all facets of energy and climate. We also provide support for startups and entrepreneurship across campus, and we also host many energy and climate-themed events such as today's distinguished lecture. Really, at the end of the day, what we care most about is catalyzing the development and deployment of breakthrough technologies, policies, and systems that drive us towards a sustainable net zero energy future. And in case you aren't already subscribed, we encourage you to take out your phones, scan this QR code. This is the best way to know what's happening in the Carnegie Mellon community around energy and climate. We don't spam you. We know emails are crazy. We distribute this newsletter once per month, and it's I'm guessing it's how many of you found out about today's event. But if not, please subscribe to keep up to date what's happening across CMU. On the occasion of Earth Day, which is coming up, we're planning a special campus event to showcase how the CMU community bridges the gap between electric vehicle research, student innovation, and real-world application. So this event features a high-energy innovation zone with student-built electric Carnegie Mellon racing team. They have an electric car that they're going to have on display, as well as the Carnegie Mellon Police Department is going to have their electric F-150 Ford pickup truck. Again, this is all to highlight the cutting edge of performance and public safety. Alongside these commuter connection showcases, alongside these, we're going to have a commuter connection, which is essentially folks who are going to have their own cars, their own electric vehicles, but also vehicles is not just cars and motor vehicles on the road. I'm going to have my electric bike there. We're going to have others who are going to have other electric ways of getting around. It's a really important way to display our commitment to sustainability in transportation. So at this event, attendees can directly engage with the owners and researchers driving these technologies. We're also going to be featuring our vehicle electrification research group at this event. So highly encourage you all to attend. It's right in the center of campus, right outside the Cohen University Center on April 22nd. Okay, and now I'd love to invite up to the podium the director of the Scott Institute, Costa Samaras. Costa is the trustee professor of civil and environmental engineering, and from 2021 to 2024, he took a short leave from Carnegie Mellon to serve in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. Initially as the Principal Assistant Director for Energy, and then as the OSTP Chief Advisor for Energy Policy, and then finally as the OSTP Chief Advisor for the Clean Energy Transition. So Costa, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you to the staff of the Scott Institute and to the Steinbrenner Institute for making today's event possible. Thank you to all of you for being here for this important distinguished lecture, the last one of our seminar series this semester. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Gretchen Goldman. Dr. Goldman is an environmental engineer and science policy leader whose career sits at the critical intersection of rigorous research and real-world impact. She currently serves as the president and CEO of the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she leads efforts to ensure that science informs the decisions that shape our health, safety, and future. Before returning to UCS, Dr. Goldman had held senior roles at the highest levels of government, including serving in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as an Assistant Director for Environmental Science, Engineering, Policy, and Justice, and at the U.S. Department of Transportation as Climate Change Research and Technology Director. In these roles, she made a huge difference in people's lives around the country and around the world, and worked on issues ranging from climate, equity, air quality, and the decarbonization of transportation systems. Earlier in her career, Dr. Goldman spent nearly a decade at UCS, where she led research on scientific integrity, environmental justice, and the role of science in policymaking. Dr. Goldman earned her PhD in environmental engineering from Georgia Tech and her undergraduate degree in atmospheric science from Cornell. She has testified before Congress, contributed to national policy, and is a widely respected voice on protecting the role of science in society. I consider myself extremely lucky to have gotten a chance to work with Dr. Goldman in the White House, but I really believe that our country is lucky to have Dr. Goldman's leadership at this critical moment in our history. Please welcome Dr. Gretchen Goldman.
Well, thank you so much, Costa and Daniel, and thank you all for being here and for hosting me. I am so glad to be with you today and share a little bit more about what I'm doing now and where I've been. So this is going to be a wide-ranging talk. I'm going to talk through some work that's happening now at the Union of Concerned Scientists, put that in the bigger context of what's happening in science and policy, especially at the federal level, and I would like to leave time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So what is the role of the scientist? If you ask someone on the street, they might describe something like this. A person in a lab coat, usually they're pipetting for some reason when you see the stock photos. And so, but we know in the field that there's a wide range of roles that scientists and technical experts have played throughout history. And this has included the great science communicators who make science more accessible to the masses, those who speak truth to power in calling out the misuse or the ignoring of science that's leading to public harm or private gain, to the activists and dissidents who've leveraged their knowledge, their platforms, and their standing in society to drive action, lead movements, and advance societal change in bigger ways. And there's always been, along the way, a healthy debate about the role that scientists and technical experts should play in society. And so in my own journey, I got a PhD in environmental engineering, and I thought of my role as solving big, challenging problems and thinking about where that could lead me. And I really liked the technical problems that I was working on, which was air quality modeling and health effects research. And the more I got into that, the more I found myself drawn to the policy side of the issues and how that science translated into policy decisions across levels of government. And so that drew me to DC, where I became the research director for the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I did that for a decade, doing policy from outside of government. And so this involved doing applied research, so research that answers specific policy questions, and doing a lot of communicating of that research and advocacy elements. So testifying to Congress, mobilizing the scientific community to advocate on policy, and otherwise contributing to science-based decision-making at all levels of government. And then, as you heard Costa say, I got called up to the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House under the Biden-Harris administration, where I worked on environmental justice and air quality and scientific integrity, and got to do a lot of the same kinds of topics I was working on outside of government, but got to do it from the White House side and in government, and really look at how do you drive change across federal agencies and build out a vision for the nation on these topics. And then, while I was in the White House, we had a lot of legislative victories with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS and Science Act. And that created this unprecedented opportunity on climate and clean energy progress that convinced me to stay in government. So I went over to the Department of Transportation and took on a role to launch a brand new climate change research and technology program there and build out what that could look like, both on research to contribute to decarbonization of the transportation sector, as well as building more climate resilient transportation infrastructure across the country. And then a little more than a year ago, I came back back to the Union of Concerned Scientists to lead as its president. And so to tell you a little bit more about the Union of Concerned Scientists, so we put rigorous independent science into action, developing solutions, and advocating for a healthy, safe, and just future. So we are a nonprofit group outside of government, and so we really sit at this unique place of being focused on how science is used in policy decisions, with the ability to advocate and mobilize the scientific community and activists generally to be informed, to push decision makers to take action. We work in coalition in lots of ways with other groups and other sectors to try to make progress and ensure that science-informed decisions can happen everywhere. And so the piece of that I wanted to call out for you all in this audience is our science network. So every time I do this talk, I have to update the number because it keeps growing. But we have 26,000 people in our network now. These are people with technical degrees, STEM degrees, and we have been working with them over many years to ensure that scientists can inform decisions at all levels of government. And we work with them to write op-eds, to do letters and petitions, to speak at public hearings, to engage with members of Congress, either in district meetings or calling them, for meeting with different elected officials, for otherwise ensuring that science and technical expertise informs decisions. And so this network is deployed in lots of different kinds of ways, depending on the nature of a policy engagement that we're hoping to influence. And especially for anyone interested in policy or wanting to see what this is all about, we have a ton of training webinars and toolkits available online at that QR code. And so if you're interested in any aspect of policy engagement, there's a lot of great stuff there, from technical trainings about how to write an op-ed, how to talk to your member of Congress, how to talk to a journalist, to lots of informational issues on specific active debates that you can plug into now and work with us on. So I've been back a little more than a year at the Union of Concerned Scientists now as its president, and it's been a very eventful year. And so I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about this current moment for science and technology in the United States and take stock of where we are, and then followed by where I think we should go. And so one element that we have been tracking since my first tour of Union of Concerned Scientists is looking at what we call attacks on science. And these are times where science has been misused or suppressed, or someone tampered with a scientific report, or otherwise inappropriately influenced how science moves through the decision-making process. So this is not to say that every decision needs to be based on science. There's, of course, lots of ways that we make decisions in policy world, but you cannot mess with the science in order to get the policy position you want. And so we have tracked these over the past 20 plus years, and what we've seen is that there has been a pretty sharp escalation in how many of these we are tracking under the current administration. You can see we're already at more than double the number of attacks that we saw even from the first Trump administration, and we're of course not even halfway through that this administration currently. And so we're really seeing an escalation both at the speed and the quantity of times we're seeing science be misused or abused in the federal government context. And another element of this that I really want to call out, because I think it hasn't gotten a ton of attention compared to other things in this current administration, is the really extensive cuts to federal science agency staffing. So you can see there's this really sharp drop-off in the last year where we have data. And this is fairly stark, as you can see. And another point I would reference here, just as someone who lives and works in DC, is just how jarring this is for people that are in the federal context and are used to federal staffing, which is normally very stable, as you can see, and it is not something that typically changes very drastically from administration to administration. federal employees generally have the expectation that they will serve under different presidents, that they will meet the mission of the agency under different political priorities, depending on who's in charge of the White House. And so this is kind of a standard expectation that in general, you might have to shift your priorities, your kind of work, but that you will be able to keep your job. And that expectation has been shattered to some degree. And so it's really been quite jarring to sort of see that impact this past year. And then there's a lot of other issues that are happening at federal agencies that have shifted from previous administrations in divergent ways. But one I really wanted to call out on the democratic input side is around what kinds of public input that federal agencies are being given. And so right now, this is a report we did looking at the degree to which federal science agencies have taken public input. So as part of the Administrative Procedures Act, federal agencies are expected to do notice and comment, to take public input from the public on significant rules that they're making. And we're seeing that a lot of times agencies have been circumventing this process and issuing final rules without taking that comment, or otherwise skipping parts of the process that are either legally required or expected in bigger ways. And this was a cut we did of in the first 6 months, looking at 600 final rules across 6 science agencies. And we saw many of these cases where the administration bypassed public notice and comment, and so cutting the public out of the process. And these are all rules that affect our health and safety, and it undermines this general principle of accountability and transparency that has long been a part of our federal system and our democracy. And so overall, what we're seeing when we look across the board at the science elements of what we're seeing is that compared to the first Trump administration, now under this administration, we're seeing that the speed of the threats to science is much higher. As you saw, we're seeing just more happening much faster. We're seeing a much bigger scope of it. And one thing that might be also more apparent to many of you at an academic institution is that unlike in the past, we're seeing a lot more affecting of research dollars and on the research grant side, because this is somewhere historically we didn't see as much of that. That was relatively stable across administrations. There would often be politicization of how policy decisions are made, but research dollars have been more stable historically, and so that's really a divergent from the past and an escalation in that sense. And then the last thing I'd call out is just the severity of what's been happening on the science side. There's been some ignoring of congressional mandates on science activities and really dismantling some of the independent checks on power that are in the science space. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but those are a few places where we're just seeing really a further disintegration of the way that the place that science has held in federal government contexts for many, many decades. And so I wanted to dig a little bit deeper on that just to show you what I mean by this. So there's a lot of places in the federal government where independent science and data plays a key role in broader checks and balances and accountability for policy decisions. And this happens in a few different ways that are now, unfortunately, being dismantled. So one of those elements is around buffers between political appointees and career civil servants. So when I was in the White House, I would sometimes get frustrated if I was trying to do something and it was hard to get it done because career employees that were at federal agencies would push back. But I always thought, well, it's good that I can't come in as a random White House employee and immediately do something that disrupts something a federal agency was doing, right? That things need to be in context, they need to be reviewed, they need to make sure they are done in a way that's responsible, that's consistent with the law, that has buy-in, and we're seeing a lot of that buffer between political appointees and career civil servants being removed. And one big place that we're seeing that now is some of the political interference in statistical agencies and independent commissions. So there's sort of the broader buffer between political appointees and career civil servants, and there's even more buffer, or there should be, between independent commissions and statistical agencies, because they're understood to be, it is important that they have this independence from whatever the political expectation is, but we're seeing some of that be disrupted now with some interference around FERC, and one of the high-profile ones was the firing of the National Labor Statistics head, and so there's really some problems there around that independence of that buffer. Another one is making sure that there's protections for career federal employees from being removed. Typically, these are stable jobs, and people understood it is stable, and they had protections to ensure that they could do their job, they could speak up, they could say something that their boss or a political appointee didn't like, because there was important protections for their job and their ability to do their job. But we're seeing a lot of that get disrupted with the current administration firing lots of federal workers, removing inspector generals, and gutting scientific integrity protections at federal agencies. So a lot of those protections that would have helped make federal employees feel comfortable speaking up and doing their job and saying, hey, the science actually says this drug is dangerous, or this pollution rollback will harm people, it's not an environment where they're going to feel as comfortable doing that because of what's happening now. And we're seeing a lot of places where Congress hasn't pushed back to the extent that the law says that they should. I think we're seeing this in a few places where they haven't stepped up in places where they should be. One time I really noticed this and was alarmed was around the gutting of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is a congressionally mandated longstanding body that coordinates climate research across the government, and that was dismantled, and we did not hear much from Congress. And so then the question is, what is the role of the scientific community when science and scientists are under threat? And so this is what I spend a lot of my day working on and deciding what to do. So I wanted to walk you through a few things that we're doing in this moment and where we think it is important to push back. So to counter some of these attacks and the speed at which they're happening, one thing we're doing is working to respond much more rapidly. So because the pace of things are so quickly and the media environment is so chaotic, especially now when there's a lot of other things driving attention, we've been doing a lot to try to speak up and move quick and be able to explain what's happening, because especially when science isn't always going to be the top issue on the front page, we want to be able to explain why this matters to people, what the consequences could be, if there's something we can do about it, what should we be doing about it, and what to watch for in the future. So one example of how we did this that I wanted to call out was mobilizing around the threats to the National Center for Atmospheric Research. This happened in last December when the administration made moves to say they'll dismantle NCAR, which has a pretty important and prominent role in the atmospheric science community with having supercomputers and otherwise providing significant research support for academic and federal agency institutions. And so we quickly mobilized to get the word out about this, drive actions to members of Congress. This is a session we did at the American Geophysical Union conference where we patched in Representative Neguse, whose NCAR is in his district in Colorado, to drive attention and put pressure to preserve NCAR. And so this significant attention did pause things and get more attention to drive it. It's still an active debate. I forget if that action is still active or not. I should have checked before. So that QR code might work. I'm not sure if it's still up, but it's an active fight. So if you are interested in engaging on this, we have ways to do that. And the next, to counter the scope, so the degree to which that this is so much broader in terms of the topics and the disciplines and the agencies that are being attacked, we're looking to really expand our science network and try to draw from bigger swaths of the science community so we're better prepared to react in different ways. And then another part of that is to rebuild some of that capacity for outside of government. And so this is happening in a few places, but one I wanted to call out was around federal advisory committees. So these are committees, there's thousands of them across the government, where experts from mostly academic institutions inform federal government decision-making under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So this is an important way we ensure that the government is informed by the latest science and technology advice, and it provides us really important transparency and accountability on government decisions because they deliberate in public, so you get to see what is the scientific consensus on a topic, and then we get to see, did the government make a decision consistent with that scientific advice they got or not? And so there's that accountability element to it. But under this administration, we're seeing a lot of those committees have been disrupted or terminated. So we're seeing few of them happening. And so one opportunity, or another thing I'll call out first of all, and that is we're also seeing removal of science and data from web pages of the federal government. Again, this is something that historically you would keep up data and research on government web pages because people rely on those things in their research, in other decision-making at other levels of government. But we're seeing a lot of that happen, especially on more politically contentious topics like climate change, environmental justice, and equity. And so one thing that you can do about that is have independent science occur outside of government. And so think about what does it look like to rebuild or reimagine elements of this science advice and public-facing science outside of government. And this can be a really useful thing to do because it ensures that everyone can continue to see the benefits of what that science was providing. It counters any efforts to suppress the science or any misinformation that the administration might put out. It's in the broader sense of authoritarian threats. It counts as an alternative institution, and so it helps to lessen the power of the administration. And it's somewhat of a future-proof strategy because it's useful in any event, right? We keep the science going if we need to do that for longer because the federal government continues to not step up, then we can. If we return to a science-supporting government, then those functions can be passed back. So we did a toolkit about how to run an independent science advisory committee to foster a little more of that action. And a lot of this is happening. So if you are feeling despair in a lot of this, one thing I would call out to you is to think about all of the things that are happening that are in this vein. So this is all different kinds of independent science efforts. So committees and people and projects that have ensured that the science can continue even if the federal government has abdicated their responsibility to do anything here. And so I've been very heartened to see this because these are all projects that take significant hours of time and expertise and labor from people in the scientific community to build things and make them available to the public. And so it's really impressive, in my opinion. And then one thing I just wanted to really call out is that we have also been stepping up in the courts and working to push back. The courts have been one of the more effective backstops in a lot of these attacks on science. And one way that we prevailed recently was around this Federal Advisory Committee Act when the administration had a committee of climate contrarians that they put together at the Department of Energy as a tactic to try to undermine the science of the endangerment finding, the EPA foundational scientific and legal underpinning that allows for EPA's action on climate change. And so they unlawfully convened in secret this panel of people to produce a report filled with long debunked climate climate denial talking points. And so we challenged them in court, and we won. And so after that, they disbanded the committee, have said that they did, and they have not been able to use that science argument that they had been trying to use. And so it really slowed them down and eliminated their ability to pretend that what they were doing was about science. And so that's been one way the courts have been effective. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about some of the severity of what's happening and some of the bigger challenges and how we're thinking about it there. So we know that there's a lot of elements to what we're seeing now where democracy is under threat, and some of that democratic backsliding's occurring across venues at the federal level. And I would argue that the targeting of science is not an accident here. When we look at authoritarian regimes in other countries and contexts throughout history, we see that often it's scientists and academics that are targeted. There's attacks on academic freedom and suppressing of science agencies that we're seeing now, trying to suppress some of that politically inconvenient science data and programming that the federal government had, and removing some of those independent checks on power with gutting of scientific integrity protections and whistleblower protections and removal of the inspector generals. And so these are the ways that science and data intersect with some of these other challenges that we're seeing around democratic backsliding. And so we're starting to think about, well, what is the role that scientists have in this bigger fight and these bigger challenges that our country's facing? And so I wrote an editorial in Science Magazine talking about this element and what the opportunity is around scientists and organizing around this. I think there's an important role that the scientific community should play in speaking out against these actions, and to the extent we can, be a unified front in the face of some of these attacks, refusing to comply, not obeying in advance on some of these issues, and building these alternative institutions like independent science efforts to lessen their power. And so that is a few ways we're thinking big on those efforts and what our contributions can be as an organization that is free from having to being constrained. We're not constrained by funding, so we're independently funded. We don't take government money or corporate money, and so we're able to be brave than a lot of other institutions are able to in this moment. And so that to me carries with it this responsibility of what can we do, what should I be doing in this moment to do what we can to fight for science and democracy. And I'll flip it over to do Q&A and discussion, but before I do, I wanted to just quickly end with giving you a sense of what's happening now. I think if you look across headlines, you might see some challenges around science and what's happening in the United States right now. But when I look across the news and what's happening, I also notice a lot of the things that we are seeing that are unprecedented levels of science speaking up in ways that I haven't seen before in my decade of doing this work. And one is how scientists have been speaking up, and even federal scientists have left and spoken up and talked about the impact of what has happened. And I would just emphasize, having recently been a career federal scientist, that you're so programmed to not have an opinion because you're in the government and you just want to like follow the rules, and you're so programmed that way. And so I was amazed and surprised and grateful that people that have left government have been brave and spoke out about this was happening to me, and this action that they're taking is going to have this negative impact on the nation and people. And there's just been so much bravery, and I've just felt so much gratitude for a lot of the federal scientists that have been speaking out. Some of them who are still there, too. Some people that have stayed in government and still been speaking out, which is very cool to see. And we saw, of course, Congress rejected a lot of the steep science budget cuts that we were expecting to see. And we've been seeing some court victories allow for more of that funding to get out, as well as providing a backstop like the Federal Advisory Committee Act that we went on, being a backstop on the policy side of ways that science is being misused in policy decisions. And so when you see those negative headlines, remember there's also positive headlines, and I'm seeing really cool ways that the scientific community is speaking up in bigger ways. And so what is the role of the scientist in 2026? I think it is critical that the scientific and academic communities stand together in this moment, that anyone that has positional power can use it and stand up and do everything we can to preserve a future where science continues to be done and continues to inform our policy decisions. So stay informed, stay hopeful, and stay focused on the science. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen, for that wonderful, well, eye-opening but inspiring talk. I'm sure we have lots of questions in the room. We have roughly 15 minutes for questions, and in Scott Institute tradition, we'll take the first question from a student in the room. And
Thank you so much, Doctor. We really appreciate you coming to talk to us today. Big fan of the UCS. In a time that publications are perhaps diluted a little in their value to LLMs, do you think of any other metrics that universities should strive for when judging what is a good scientist and what a good scientist might be doing, rather than churning out papers that only an LLM might read many of the times?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I'm quite as positioned about what would be of greatest value within the academic context, but I can say that in terms of what's influential in DC, in policy conversations and thinking about that realm of things, it can be so impactful for experts and scientists to speak out or comment on policy conversations. Because in policy world, everything is faster, right? It's not, we can't wait 9 months for a publication to come out. It's a decision that needs to happen quicker. And it's often decisions are being made before you have the full set of information, right? Because it's a policy proposal that's moving, or members of Congress are reacting to an event that is spurring action. And so things tend to happen quicker. And so there often is incomplete information. And so we're sort of trained in academia, right, to not, you don't talk about something until you're 110% sure about that thing and you're already sick of talking about it. Then it's time to say it out loud, right, externally. But in policy world, the train is moving whether scientists are on it or not, whether there's expert input on it or not. And so I think a lot about the value of speaking up, even if you don't know everything about a topic and a particular issue that's coming up. The more that you can just say what you do know and ask and help people making decisions about it understand what to think about, understand the scale of things, anything you're able to say as a technical expert is really valuable in policy discourse, because even sometimes things that in academia would seem very basic or obvious to you as a researcher can be really valuable for a decision maker to hear who's not an expert in that topic but needs to make a decision tomorrow about what to do about something. So that means anything writing, any speaking, social media, any opportunity to sort of get your voice out into the conversation.
Thank you for the awesome talk. I had a question about the external resources that you've been putting together with this organization. I'm curious, how you make these accessible to people who may see them as politically leaning in one way, because I think whenever they're shared by the government, generally people accept them more, but if they're shared by a specific nonprofit organization, people who may lean politically in another direction may not want to listen to that. So how do you kind of publish them in a way that makes them more accessible across the political aisle?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, a lot of that is the value and the power of these federal advisory committees, right? It comes with that authority because you know it is government-based, you know there was a vetting process, you know it is balanced in terms of who's on it, and so we can't really replace that, right? And we shouldn't try because that's a government function, and it should be a government function. And so when we do it, we're very clear. We're first just very clear that like the intention is not to long-term just have it live with us or with anyone outside of government. The point is it's a government responsibility that we are filling in the gap now because of the need, but it is not our job, right? That it should be the government's job. So one is to keep that frame. The other way that we do it is to be really clear about what role we're playing. So if it is just a convening role, then we make very clear that we're just the convener and we're not weighing in on what the decision is of the scientists that are convening. And the other way that we can do that is through transparency too, right? If you live stream the whole meeting, if you be really clear about here's the documents and here's who wrote them, then you can build some of that context for the impartial nature that's so important for those.
As a non-academic with a policy background, I think this is purely inspiring, and I hope that everyone in this room takes up your calls. I'm curious, you focused a lot in your presentation on the federal government, but there's a shift, especially in the past few years, to look more at local government, city and state government, and also consider international commitments and global engagement. I'm curious if this is something that you've looked at or you're actively doing.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's so much opportunity at the state and local level, and in fact, a lot of decisions only happen at those levels. I was at the Department of Transportation and doing a lot of research there, and one thing about transportation is a lot of those decisions are state decisions, they're MPO decisions, they're at the city level in terms of what gets built and who decides where roads go and whether or not they put in a train or a bike lane or anything, right? Those aren't federally controlled to a large degree. So there's lots of opportunity at the state and local level. I didn't focus on it here, but we do also do a lot of other levels of government work with working at the state level. A lot of the energy grid work we do is in that realm too, where we know there's a lot of conversations happening local and statewide now about cleaning the grid and how are we doing transmission and where are we building data centers and what sources of energy are we using and how clean are those sources. And so we do a lot of work there. And I'll say as a broad brush that that's also where technical information and technical experts engaging can be even more valuable sometimes because there's even fewer people tracking that, or there's fewer resources in terms of them having expert reports and things to rely on to inform the decision. And so that can be a place to be really influential in terms of science advocacy. And yeah, I think I would just say in this moment, especially given the abdication of federal leadership on climate and clean energy issues, there's a lot of need to focus at other levels of government to sort of keep us in the game internationally for a lot of groups that think about that, and local and state level. And then I would throw in private sector too, in that a lot of the private sector leadership of the past few years we've seen a lot of that momentum can continue, and we can help ensure that it does continue even if the federal government has changed direction.
So you mentioned the endangerment rescission, and I know that that's now being litigated quite severely, shall we say.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of how what short-term damage may accrue from that decision? And if you're interested in speculating on how the long-term litigation might play out, I'd be fascinated to hear.
Yeah. So I didn't end the story, but we won that case about the DOE report, and then we turned around and immediately sued them again on the EPA rescission of the endangerment finding. So I can't comment on the specifics because it's an active case for us. But so continuing to fight that fight there. I think in the near term, I mean, it's very damaging. I mean, I think especially on the vehicles side, where companies are making decisions now about where to build and where to invest and where to disinvest. And, I think it is going to be consequential in lots of ways. And adding to the revoking of the California waiver and other elements to it. So I think we do need to take it seriously and do what we can to continue progress in spite of it.
Thank you for giving your time to us today. We really appreciate it. One of the reasons that one of the drivers of the actions of the current administration, the decline in public trust in science, driven by pandemic and other things. UCS can't do everything, but I'm wondering if if you all are thinking about that, partnering with others. That's not an easy thing to address, but it is a driver, so I imagine it comes up once in a while, and would welcome your thoughts about what UCS is thinking about, can do, is partnering with others to do on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And we can't do everything, but I'm always open to ideas about what we should be doing given the range of opportunities, we'll say, to engage on different issues. Yeah, the public trust element is interesting. I agree it's been damaged in recent years, partially by COVID, as you said, and I worry about what's happening now in this new environment, given a lot of the misinformation that's coming out and this administration's posture on it. I don't know what that's going to do to the way people perceive it. So I think it means, I've been thinking it means that we need to do a better job as a community to decide how to rebuild that trust. And a lot of people have thought about that for a long time in building public trust in science. And do we need to do more community engaged science or science cafes or places where we're intersecting with the public more? And so I will not pretend to have the answer on that, but I feel like this current moment indicates we need to rethink what the best way to do that is, because I think we're just in this moment where it's been challenged in ways it hasn't been before, right? I think especially I see this in the health community, where I think the health agencies have enjoyed broad public support for a long time, all the HHS agencies and National Institutes of Health and, all of the ways that we fund medical research and are the world leader in a lot of those areas. And that has long been a bipartisan project to ensure that those research dollars get out. And we saw that got targeted this year. And I personally just think we weren't really ready for that, right? Because we're sort of used to it on the kind of environmental side of needing to defend progress and the work. But I don't think anybody was really prepared to have to say, well, cancer research is good, actually. And, we haven't needed an army to argue that, right? And so, but now it's clearly we need to rethink how we make sure that we are insisting those things are important, and here's why the public and decision makers need to be invested in continuing that.
These have been great questions. Unfortunately, we have time for just one last question.
Okay. Thank you so much for an inspiring talk. We have a lot of students in the audience and in our network that are interested in a career in policy from different angles. Maybe you can just give them some advice about what they could be doing right now to jumpstart their career in policy.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would first just say, don't give up, even if the short-term outlook isn't, or you don't immediately get an opportunity in that space, because it is so desperately needed. We need people with technical expertise that can communicate, that can engage in policy, that can work through all of these challenges that might seem messier or more complex than working in the lab. But it's I think the only way that we all get out of this is that we insist on a society that uses science for public good, and technical experts are a key piece of that. And so even if there are limited federal opportunities in the near term, the need for technically trained, policy savvy people is not going away, because we're going to need it at all levels of government. We're going to need people, no matter which career path you take. Having engaged technical experts has always proven helpful, and we've seen this on all of our issues with all of our network, where the thing that can make the difference is sometimes an in-district meeting with a couple scientists from that local community who take the time to go talk to their member of Congress and explain why it matters locally. And we've seen that on all kinds of issues, and we need scientists to engage now more than ever. And so don't give up. And definitely, I would say in the short term, any practice, anytime you are able to sort of get your feet wet in translating technical content for lay audiences, in trying to communicate a complex topic, and just learning about the policy process, anything you can do to sort of practice some of that communication and policy-oriented work is really valuable. I found it really valuable to do that as a student and early in my career, to sort of get a better sense of how science intersects with decision making and where you can weigh in, and you can do that at all levels of government and all different issues to practice and hone that skill.
Well, Gretchen, we are very, very grateful for your time today, and we are inspired and excited to see what UCS does moving forward, and we're also very excited to get involved. So thank you, and please join me in giving Dr. Gretchen Goldman.
Okay.